Hi everyone, Adam here. So today's topic is a little bit, it may sound like I am pulling your leg. It may sound like I am messing with you. But the thing is that when it comes to a certain kind of injury, there is this one weird trick that is extremely effective at preventing and, if you've already been injured, at preventing re-injury as well, preventing this kind of injury. And so this is hamstrings injury. So hamstrings injury makes up the single largest, source of non-contact injuries in a lot of sports, simply because your hamstrings are super important for running. And so any sport that involves running, your hamstrings are extremely important. And so you're simply, when you have basically, when you're running a lot, the hamstrings get injured. That tends to happen. And so as a result, hamstrings injuries are extremely common in any sport that involves running. And the interesting thing again is that they are also extremely preventable. And the reason for that is essentially that they've and this has been super well researched. They have done a crap ton of research on this. And they discovered that essentially eccentric hamstrings exercises lower the injury rate by like 2/3. Cut it to 1/3 of its your original chance. And so what is an eccentric hamstrings exercise? So if you know enough exercise science, if you're a trainer or whatever, to know what eccentric and concentric and isometric mean, then this is whatever, you can skip over this part. But essentially, all movements have three phases, or three parts. There is a lifting phase, where you are moving the weight, and so that's if it's a bench press, you're pushing the bar away from you. If it's a squat, you're standing up. If it's a deadlift, you're lifting the barbell. That's the concentric phase of the action. Then you have the eccentric phase of the action, which is the lowering phase. So when you're doing a bench press, it's when you're pulling that bar, down to your chest with control. When you're squatting, it's when you're coming down before you stand back up. And then there's also isometric phases, which are phases in which essentially you're not moving. So basically, if you did like a pause bench press where you held it at the bottom, that's an isometric at the bottom there. It's an isometric at the top as well. Same thing with squat, same thing with deadlift, etc. So the eccentric phase of most exercises tends to cause a little bit more soreness, partly because people aren't used to doing heavy eccentrics, which is to say exercises where you emphasize the eccentric phase. So typically when you're emphasizing the eccentric phase, there's some exercises that have only an eccentric or a concentric phase just because of the way they're built or designed. You usually release the weight at some point, although those are much less common. Now, typically, how we do eccentrics is you just do a very slow lowering phase, nice and controlled, maybe using a little bit more weight than you can normally handle, and then you're doing a quick concentric pushing or moving phase. And typically, it also helps to have specialized equipment, which makes this easier. It's it's useful to have a training partner who can help you with the concentric phase so that you're doing less of the work there, so you can focus more on the eccentric phase. Whatever it is, essentially eccentric exercise tends to be, you tend to be a little bit stronger in the eccentric phase of your movement. You tend to also, again, generate a little bit more soreness, although that's partly because you may not be used to it, so it may require just a little more getting used to. And there is some evidence that may build a little bit more muscle as well. But the problem is that then your gains in strength are specific to the eccentric phase. So when you practice a lot of eccentrics, you get better at lowering weights, but you don't get better at raising them, which seems weird to people, because you lift weights to get better at lifting them, not lowering them. So yeah, basically eccentrics are not super popular for that reason, simply because, strength-wise, it's way more useful to do a lot of concentric motions. But again, some eccentric motions may be useful. So what is a good eccentric hamstrings exercise? Well, you can do stuff like the leg curl in your standard gym leg curl machine. You can also do the exercise that they've studied the most and that has the most that is the most ideal is called the Nordic hamstrings curl. So with the Nordic hamstrings curl, you're essentially, you're putting your knees on a pad on the floor, you're anchoring your heels behind you, whether someone's holding them down or, you've put them under a box with some weight on it or something like that to prevent, that from coming up. And then you're essentially doing a controlled fall forwards to the floor while using your hamstrings as much as possible to slow you down. When you hit the floor, obviously you're going into a push-up position. You're catching yourself with your hands, using that to push yourself back up to reset, and then you're again falling forward. If this is confusing, just search Nordic hamstring curl YouTube video. You'll find something that'll make it clear. So the Nordic hamstrings curl is kind of the ideal one. It may not be it just may not be possible for you. You may not have the necessary equipment or setup or a training partner. So again, any kind of exercise that targets the hamstrings works. RDLs, kettlebell swings, hyperextensions, reverse hyperextensions, and so on. But those also tend to involve other muscles as well. Ideally, the best kind of hamstring training involves essentially extension at the hip while the knee is bent, which is what you see in the leg curl, which is what you see in the Nordic hamstring curl. So those are kind of the more ideal ways to target your hamstrings, but you can target the hamstrings in a variety of ways. And again, any kind of sport involving running, first of all, training the hamstrings is useful. Second of all, training the hamstrings eccentrically is massively useful at preventing lower body injury, or if you've already been injured, again, preventing future re-injury and rehabbing, for future performance as well. They actually have they did a research review a year or two ago where they, summarized all the research, and they had to title it something hilariously passive-aggressive, which was basically, that this works super well when people actually do it, because they were discovering that the problem was that, when you tell people to do eccentric hamstrings exercises, a lot of the people that were, being studied simply weren't doing it, and so that was why they weren't seeing results. But when they were doing it, they were seeing, again, huge increases or decreases in injury rates. So yeah, absolutely, just astoundingly effective, extremely effective, and that is the closest thing to a hack I will see in terms of preventing injury. And I think that's also interesting because, again, this is conjecture on my part. This is not studied. This is not something that I can really say with any amount of certainty. But I think that certainly some amount of eccentric focus on exercises that we do, elsewhere in all kinds of other things may also be useful for, again, helping prevent injury. One thing that's interesting about the deadlift is that the deadlift does have a concentric phase, you're raising it up to the waist, and then an eccentric phase, you're lowering it back down to the floor. But most people de-emphasize that eccentric phase so much because they're essentially just dropping it, or they're essentially just doing a controlled drop where you're just barely holding onto the bar. Same thing kind of with the bench press. Sometimes we're super lazy about the lowering phase. We don't try and control it. Squat, people tend to be a little bit more controlled, but any kind of overhead press, Olympic lifts don't have an eccentric phase because you're dropping it from overhead. It's totally concentric. And overhead presses, virtually completely concentric. I mean, you do have to, if you're pushing it up and then you have to do a controlled, drop back to the shoulders. But if you're doing that with a barbell, it's less controlled and more of a drop in most cases, honestly. So yeah, it's essentially most people, most of the time, don't really give much of any shits about the eccentric phase. They don't care too much. Does that mean that doing a lot more eccentric work is going to make you stronger or bigger? Not necessarily. Is it going to make you bulletproof? Again, not necessarily, but it certainly may help injury rates at the very least with your hamstrings. It is remarkably effective, amazingly effective. So that is my rant for today. As always, like, comment, share. Tell me what you want to see in future videos. I will talk to you guys next time. Have a good one.